Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Joining us for the second half of our show is the president of Manifold Productions, Michael Pack, an independent documentary producer and former senior vice president for television programming at the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here, Bill.
Michael, as a documentary filmmaker, you live a life of sharing narrative with others. Tell us about the power of narrative.
Well, I think narrative is the primary means of moving people everywhere and always has been. I mean, I try to tell narratives that also convey deeper meanings, but yes, the means of doing that is through narrative, through stories.
And this goes back to before the written language.
Well, that's right. You know, back to Homer, back to Gilgamesh, the sort of earliest narrative. Mm-hmm. And right from the start, I mean, Homer and others were looking at what it means to live a virtuous life, what it means to be a hero, what it means to have honor or courage. And the way to look at that is through narrative. Not just because it's a means of communicating an idea, but because narrative allows you to tell a much more complex, nuanced picture. Achilles, it's a complex view of what it means to be a warrior, with a man with obvious difficulties and foibles and excess of anger, but a hero in some other ways. So narrative allows Homer to tell a complicated story.
For those of us who come up from a different school of education, I'm an engineer, we were trained in a very different tradition than the liberal arts tradition. How is it that we haven't been able to learn how to use narrative to get stories across?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, my current documentary is a documentary about Admiral Rickover, also an engineer. But one of Admiral Rickover's strengths was he was, in a way, able to use narrative. He fashioned his own legend and his own story and narratives about what he was doing. And in an area like that, engineering, where most people can't use narrative, those few who can rise to the top.
But considering how complex the machines he was building, the first nuclear submarines, to be able to handle the power, the safety, this was a big engineering challenge.
Well, it isn't all narrative. Right.
He's got to have both.
He had a vast and deep engineering knowledge. I mean, and a practical one. He was, trained as an engineer at Columbia. But he always said that he got his engineering experience climbing around subs and ships during World War II, repairing them. And he had decades of actual hands-on experience before he came up with the idea of trying to build the first nuclear submarine, the Nautilus, after the war.
And every mistake he made had a story attached to it, I'm sure.
Yes. He wasn't just telling stories about that. He would tell stories about himself and the need to make the submarine and in making the case for Congress. In terms of his engineering practice, he might not be so story-oriented. He, I think, pioneered techniques that are common today in places like Silicon Valley, where people were free to disagree and argue. Mm-hmm. For example, Admiral Rickover forbade the wearing of uniforms for anyone who worked with him. And that is very contra to the ethos of the military. It's very based on uniforms and hierarchy. But he was against hierarchy. He wanted people of lower rank talking to people of higher rank, and higher rank to people of lower rank, and civilians to uniform people without feeling any constraint. So he forbade anyone wearing uniforms.
And he had a method then.
He had a method, and he had many innovative management techniques. I would say the use of narrative would be his technique for selling his program to Congress.
Well, every good salesman's a storyteller. That goes without saying.
That does go without saying. And he fashioned, like all successful figures, the story of himself. And I think that's a key thing for people to be able to do. And I would say in the tech world of today, you have Stephen Jobs who did that as well. He is often compared to Admiral Rickover. We have someone describe Admiral Rickover in my film as a genius and an SOB.
Yeah, that's Steve.
And I think that's right. That's Stephen Jobs too. So they have that legend, and they play with it and against it when they're smart, like those two.
Now, this program recently premiered to private audiences, and it will play in the fall on PBS. Is that the plan?
It'll play on PBS in the fall or shortly thereafter. Mm-hmm.
I recently watched both the Hamilton and Rediscovering Washington documentaries you put together. I was particularly fascinated with the Hamilton one. You could call him one of the engineers of democracy. And as a Jeffersonian, of course, I have many bones to pick with Hamilton. but the way you assembled it was quite different.
That's true. And we are planning to do Jefferson next.
Thank you.
So then the Hamiltonians will have bones to pick. But the point of yes, I tell stories, but each time I do a project, I have to think through the storytelling technique.
Mm-hmm.
And in the Rediscovering series, which we've done with Richard Brookhiser, who is a renowned author and is the host of the show, we came up with the idea of, in addition of trying to be the un-Ken Burns. I know Ken personally, and I'm a fan of his work, but we wanted to do it different, tell history differently.
A little differently.
So we tried to downplay the use of talking heads and slow pans on stills and find another way at getting at these great historical figures.
Many on-site scenes, even short ones. There must have been a lot of travel involved.
That's right. And we look for the reflection of these people in the present. In addition to telling the story of their lives, we looked at how does the present cast light on the past.
Mm-hmm.
So since Hamilton dealt with the world's first financial crisis in the 1790s and we were shooting in 2008, conveniently, America was in the midst of another economic crisis. So we talked to Hank Paulson, then Treasury Secretary, and asked him, what did he think of what Hamilton did, and what does he think Hamilton would think of what he did? And then we talked to some other economists who had a different view of all that. So there was that discussion, but also Hamilton was shot in a duel over honor.
And you interviewed gang members.
Indeed, because who else today has had gunfights over honor? We tend to think it's ridiculous to fight over honor. It's nothing. Honor is nothing. They should have just, avoided shooting each other.
I don't know that it's nothing, but to throw your life away in a gun duel seems like a pretty stupid thing to do.
To us, but it did not seem that way to these gang members. They were saying, yeah, someone disses you, you've got to stand up to them or you can't be effective ever again. So they understood what it means to fight over honor, as have men from Homer to today. Achilles would have understood, and so would warriors from Achilles to today. But in American society, the idea of honor, it's either in gangs or in the military, otherwise vanished. So it was important to Hamilton and others of the founders. So we wanted to recall what living by an honor code was like. So we talked to these gang members. And so we look for many reflections in the present. But it is not our goal to advocate Hamilton's views, and it will not be in the Jefferson film our goal to advocate Jefferson's views.
That actually came clear. You weren't selling anything in that. You were just telling.
So I think that these are complicated men, and Jefferson, too, is a complicated man. I mean, he had controversial views on race in addition to his possible affair with Sally Hemings. His views on race were complex, and his view on the French Revolution.
Yes, yeah.
For which he was an early proponent.
Didn't work out too well for him, did it?
And into the beginning of the terror, it did not. But on the other hand, he wrote the Declaration of Independence, I think the greatest document in American political history, and his ideas and his thinking and his personality and vision affected all of America since. So it's important to grasp them and understand them.
I'm so looking forward to it. I have to say the Washington documentary, the Rediscovering Washington, most of the stories I had heard before, the one piece of it that struck me as being very different was the section on charisma. We were always taught he was a cold man. He was unapproachable. He was cold. And you built up, look, this guy could not have been so successful. And you brought in elements of drama, which I'd never heard before. That was very different.
Well, that was an important part of the film. You are to be commended for having heard all those stories. I think we can't count on the young people in school today having heard them all.
No, probably not.
But it is true. You can't understand Washington without understanding his charisma. He was clearly the most charismatic figure of the age, and people who liked him and didn't like them, everyone agreed on that. Charisma is not something that can be doubted. It's there. It's something easily recognized. And people from Abigail Adams to Thomas Jefferson all agreed. When Washington walked in the room, all eyes were on him. From the beginning. He
commanded a room.
Commanded a room. Now, it's true that charisma in the 18th century would be cold by our standards. I mean, they had a neoclassical view, and so restraint was part of, and dignity was part of what made them appealing.
He didn't play the saxophone or tell you what kind of underwear he was wearing.
He did not do that. It was a different time. But he was a great dancer, and he loved music, and he loved hearing other people's jokes. I mean, one of Washington's great characteristics was making other people talk and bringing the good out of other people. So he was, in that sense, both charismatic and important. And the film pivots on the key thing that Washington did. I mean, he was a charismatic military leader who led a revolutionary army to victory. And unlike every other person like that in human history.
In 2,000 years.
In 2,000 years, Napoleon, Cromwell, Caesar, they all ended up seizing power, whatever they said. And Washington gave it up twice. Once he gave up power to the Continental Congress after winning the war, and then he withdrew from the presidency after the second term.
Which is why King George called him the greatest man in the world.
Indeed. But it is one thing to give up power when you don't have it, and you're not a charismatic military leader. You know, for you or I to give up power may be easier than when you have the temptation of being able to wield it and command it. And not that many people have had that temptation. It's a small group, really. And of that small group, only Washington has really given it up. So the charisma part was essential to understanding Washington's signal achievement. If you don't get it, it's hard to understand
Washington. It came
Washington.
through very strongly.
But it is true that the Washington show, we discovered in making the Washington show this technique of finding history in the present, reflections in the present. So we did a lot more of it with Hamilton. But it's easier to do films about complicated characters like Hamilton and Jefferson than Washington, whose goodness really shined through almost every aspect of his character. A harder man to make a film about.
So, Michael, you have a lot of experience in public television. You were Senior Vice President of Television Programming for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and have quite a bit of knowledge about the inside of CPB, PBS, and NPR. Tell us a little bit about your tenure there.
Well, I was there for about 3 years, which is what I signed on for. And when I came to CPB, I had the mandate from my president and the board to try to do new initiatives, and in particular to try to bring in new voices, because there was a perception by both the board and the president that there needed to be a wider array of voices on public broadcasting, an opinion I shared completely. So I developed 2 projects to do that. And the first was called America at the Crossroads. It was 20 films that dealt with post 9/11 issues, and this was 2003, 2004, 2005. So we funded 20 programs, fully funded them, and they were broadcast in prime time on public television. And we tried to reach out to kinds of people who may not ever have had their own show on public television before, such as Richard Pearl or Carl Zinsmeister, then with the American Enterprise Institute. But I also wanted to reach out to the left. I mean, the people on the left say that PBS tends to the mainstream, and I think that's true. They tend to be where the New York Times and the Washington Post is. So,
and that's considered mainstream?
Well, it's where the mainstream press is, let's put it that way. So I want to reach out further to the left as well, and I tried to do that too. I think public television, needs to reflect a huge diversity of voices. I mean, that's one of its primary reasons for being. So I did that through that project, and I launched another project, a History and Civics initiative designed to teach history and civics to middle and high school students.
Now, just as it's pretty well known that if you look at the journalism profession, political views tend to be centered all around the left of center, perhaps with the exception of some of the financial press. There's a knock on NPR and PBS that it tends to take a very left of center perspective. Did you find inside the executive ranks that there was a toleration for a diversity of views?
Well, one of the problems in public broadcasting is that most of the people who work there are themselves liberal Democrats, so that their just natural inclination is in that direction. And I do think it's important to have a more diverse group, even working there, to have more diverse ideas. But I think that there was an acknowledgement, at least when I was there, that the mission of public broadcasting is to reflect a diversity of views. I think sometimes they didn't necessarily have the best ideas about how to do that, but there was an acknowledgement that that was part of what they were asked by Congress to do.
Those folks have always been comfortable with goals, targets, or quotas, depending on what you want to call it, for racial and ethnic diversity. How do you think they would react to goals or targets for intellectual diversity?
Well, I don't think they would be too happy about it. I mean, I'm not in favor of quotas in any of these categories, actually. But I do feel that an outreach to conservative and libertarian voices is more than appropriate on behalf of NPR and public broadcasting, even now.
Do you think there'd be a market for it?
I think those shows would be just as popular as the shows that they have now. Yes, I think there's a market for it. And I think there's, if you look at the country, It's split from election to election, so at least half the people are on the Republican side and half are on the Democratic side, so there's got to be a market for all those ideas.
Before we started chatting, we were talking about how the right seems to have a tougher time with narrative. Why do you think that is?
I'm not sure, but I think it is definitely a fact. The left has a better understanding of the importance and value of stories and of art and culture in general. And has been for a while. I don't think, some people think that that's just the nature of these two positions, but I don't think so.
Is it a right brain, left brain thing?
I don't think so, because there are plenty of right of center great artists if you go back far enough in time. I mean, it depends how you define right of center. The economic arguments may not make sense if you go back too far, but talking about classical ideas. I mean, Virgil wrote the Aeneid, arguably the most powerful epic, in service to Augustus Caesar. So that's not conservative. What is?
Yeah.
It may not be a conservative position that we would necessarily endorse, but he did it, and it's a great work. So I don't think it's written into the nature of art that it has to be on the left, but it has been on the left for a while. I will say, I like to say when this subject comes up in defense of public television, which I know more about than public radio, that when I was there, people at the Public Broadcasting Service said to me, there have been had many requests over the years to do more right of center programming, and most of what they get just doesn't meet their quality standards. And I feel that's an actually legitimate objection that they are often right about.
Do you think there's just a smaller pool to draw from, and so you don't get as much quality coming to the top?
I do think that's true. I think one of the reasons for it is that film schools are graduating huge pools of people that are generally schooled in left-leaning, liberal, kind of anti-capitalist filmmaking. And there are thousands and thousands of them every year being graduated, of which only 2 or 3% ever make it. But there is no such pool to skim for people with the opposite point of view.
So should the Koch brothers fund the film school?
I think they should. And more than one. I mean, here in Washington, where we are right now, there are film schools everywhere. American University has one, George Washington University has one, Georgetown has one, University of Maryland has one, and they are, and so it's just like in every other area. If you want it to change the way people think, sometimes you have to go back to the academy where the thing begins.
I speak to students quite frequently, and one of the things I tell them is what the libertarian movement really needs is more stand-up comics and single-panel cartoonists. Where can we find some of those?
Well, I mean, I think the filmmaking thing would be easy. Young people do want to make films and documentaries, and I do think it would be great for there to be more diversity in film schools. My wife and I have actually been trying to start a film center here in this area, but they're just like the libertarian conservative side is less interested in stories. They're less interested in supporting film schools. But I think there needs to be several of them. I mean, there's been that in other areas in the academy where people have funded things where they think there is not enough diversity of ideas, often in the area of economics.
Certainly.
Where free market economic chairs are started at different and institutes are started at various universities, such as at George Mason University here in town. They're
very impactful.
Very impactful, and I think it would be easy to do the same thing in the area of film and television. It's just that it's very hard to get the interest on the other side.
Do you think it would take a tech entrepreneur to maybe support something like that, as opposed to someone who made their money in Hollywood?
Yeah, I think it would take an entrepreneur from some other area, not necessarily someone from Hollywood.
Michael, other than film schools, what else could be done to get some more balance in the media?
I think the key thing is the creation of institutions, period. Film schools are one of them, but sort of on the left, broadly considered, you see plenty of film distribution companies, film production companies, in the area of documentaries, but also in the area of sort of small, arty feature films. I mean, there are these companies like Magnolia that regularly fund left-leaning films, and there are some that film companies where their declared purpose is to influence the way people think, and the people who fund them are willing to make a bunch of films and are confident that they'll be okay even if a few of them lose money. And we don't have those kinds of institutions on the other side. And I think it is a matter of funding them and finding the talent to run them. And I think it's a matter of not enough will on the part of people in the sort of libertarian conservative side of the spectrum. They are only focused on the next election. Very short-term thinking. And everyone knows it's short-term thinking. Shelley that says poets are the unacknowledged legislators of mankind, and it's largely recognized by everybody.
Mm-hmm.
So they know it, but they can't seem to get their minds around it. They distrust the people who make films and television and art too deeply. I'm not sure what it is, but I take your point, Bill. I think perhaps the next generation of more libertarian-oriented entrepreneurs, tech entrepreneurs, might have different views on these things
and
than the older
might
generation.
Be attracted to supporting some of the arts.
And that would be an important thing to do. Support the arts, but to support them in an intelligent way.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's a lot of people who are very careful in making their political choices, but their artistic choices they hand over to someone who just gives it to whoever is popular.
Well, that's a stereotype, isn't it? You know, it's a stereotype in novels, which actually brings me to wondering whether the Atlas Shrugged project is going to finish. It's been a struggle. I reviewed the first two movies. We're waiting for the third one to come out. It's a powerful novel, and yet, why is it not a miniseries?
Yeah, I'm not sure about the details of that project in particular, so I'd have trouble speaking about that. I think it's to those people's credit that they've gotten the first two done.
Yeah, they gave it a shot. But you'd think there'd be a wealth of material there that could find some financing.
There are no shortage of stories or possible projects. I mean, that is not the limiting factor. The two limiting factors, I think, are funding, intelligent funding by an engaged funder, not just people who hand over the money on one hand. And then I think there is a bit of a shortage of talent. That is why I focus on film schools. You know, I have been making libertarian, conservative-oriented, right-of-center, but I think pretty fair documentaries for a long time. I don't have a lot of competition. That's not a good thing. There are not a lot of other people doing that on public television, and there are not a lot of other people doing it in a form that is nationally broadcast. There really need to be a whole bunch, and not just one or two others, but a whole bunch. They need to be found and encouraged, brought along, you know, not just through film schools, but through other institutions that bring them along their career, you know, which does exist for left-leaning filmmakers. For example, public television has a group funded entirely by Corporation for Public Broadcasting called the Independent Television Service, ITVS, and they sort of take young filmmakers and bring them along. They have a big staff. They're out in San Francisco. I consider, although they try to fund diversity of programs, I'd have to say their programs tilt pretty far to the left, even further than most on public television. And they have this funding from the government to sort of bring these filmmakers along. They give them grants. They kind of help them. They help them figure out PBS. They help them figure out the distribution angle. They have a slot on the national schedule so they can bring people who are young in their career to the next stage. That's right. And I say sort of more power to them. But we need such institutions that maybe tilt in the other direction. And I think there just needs to be a will to do it.
If you look at how the media landscape is changing, particularly with streaming and YouTube, and I know you're a 90-minute documentary maker, but there's a lot of 5-minute video content there, and there's a lot of guerrilla development that's happening across the ideological spectrum. Some pretty funny stuff, some pretty compelling stuff that's coming from right of center. Is that possibly a spawning ground for the future?
I think so. I mean, I think getting rid of gatekeepers and going directly to people is always a powerful and positive force. And I think in the long run, that'll be a big plus. I mean, at the high end of film and television production, there are still new sort of gatekeepers. I mean, now you have Netflix, or Amazon is now doing some original programming. And they're the ones that can command the bigger audience and hence can justify the budgets. And you need budgets to have powerful media. But the mere fact that there will be more players and they're not necessarily tied to having bought a piece of the spectrum is a positive force. And I think long term, it'll be a positive and democratizing force. Let me add one thing about ITVS, if I might go back to that. One thing I have always proposed is that, if people want something like that, even within public broadcasting, they need to ask for another institution or an additional institution that would maybe bring other kinds of filmmakers along. And I have tried to do that as well.
Michael, it's been delightful chatting with you. What's your next project?
Well, we always have several projects in development, and we have many that we would like to do. I mentioned the Jefferson film. We are working with Amity Schley's, a great author.
Oh, she's terrific.
And journalist, on a Coolidge.
Oh, you're going to do a Coolidge piece with Amity?
Yes.
Oh, that's going to be fantastic.
And that is great. And and we have narrative, feature films that we would like to do. And so they're all in development, and who knows what is next. And I hope they all come to be.
Very much looking forward to it. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you.
That wraps up our show for this week. We've been talking with Michael Pack, president of Manifold Productions, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. See you next week, same time, same station, here on Bloomberg Boston and WROM Detroit.